quote, "Nothing," Chambers says, "could better show the disproportion of Beowulf, which puts the irrelevances in the center and the serious things on the outer edges, than this passing allusion to the story of Ingeld. For in this conflict between plighted troth and the duty of revenge, we have a situation which the old heroic poets loved, and would not have sold for a wilderness of dragons." End quote. I pass over the fact that the allusion has a dramatic purpose in Beowulf that is a sufficient defense both of its presence and of its manner. The author of Beowulf cannot be held responsible for the fact that we now have only his poem and not others dealing primarily with Ingeld. He was not selling one thing for another, but giving something new. But let us return to the dragon, a wilderness of dragons. There is a sting in this Shylockian plural, the sharper for coming from a critic who deserves the title of the poet's best friend. It is in the tradition of the Book of St. Albans, from which the poet might retort upon his critics, "Yea, a desert of lapwings, a shrewdness of apes, a raffle of knaves, and a gaggle of geese." Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien, a wilderness of dragons. Can you imagine? Wouldn't that be magnificent? How could you possibly want to trade Ingeld for a wilderness of dragons, or vice versa? Well, here, Tolkien, in his famous essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, is calling to task his fellow scholars for dismissing the monsters, particularly the dragons, as not really the point of great heroic poetry. That people like, here he's quoting Chambers, who is himself quoting from someone else about how what we would as scholars really want to have in Old English poetry, particularly in Beowulf, is more about Ingeld, who we only hear about in passing in Beowulf, and rather less about those dragons, right? And the poet properly, as Chambers says, the old heroic poets loved stories of plighted troth and the duty of revenge, and real poets wouldn't have traded those stories, the sort of political machinations and the conflicts between human beings, for any number of dragons. Well, it's quite remarkable to imagine that someone would want to have a story of revenge and plighted troth without dragons, right? Game of Thrones, anyway. I mean, it's like, how can you imagine a time in which the scholars didn't want more and more and more dragons? Well, maybe you actually can, because, well, what do we do? Last time we talked about the problem of the criticisms that reviewers have brought to Tolkien. Now we're backing into the story a bit and saying, well, Tolkien had trouble convincing people even to read Beowulf, right? Even to read the great, stories of English literature, and to find out that he had to defend the dragons. It's rather difficult to imagine, right? They're dragons, absolutely. I went through my bookshelves looking for dragons today, and found these are stories that I don't actually know yet. Catherine Kerr's, my husband's reading them. Apparently dragons sell books, right? That should make them quite magnificent. They sell books not only in English, but in translation. In German, Wachen is guards, and this is Terry Pratchett's great dragon story, when they summon the dragon and the guards have to fight him. I grew up, of course, reading Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders books. The dragons in her stories are incredibly sexy. Or you might be familiar, going back even further into your bookshelves, with, well, of course, dragonology. Don't we all want to find out about the different categories of dragons, the different species of dragons? I promised you in the title of this episode, a taxonomy of dragons. So we might have Western dragons and European dragons. My little Welsh dragon is in there barking. Just ignore her. I know you all love dogs because you're on this channel, right? We have Eastern dragons, Chinese dragons. Ooh, I've got some dragons here, right? And, of course, by now, you know that I have, well, absolutely every dragon you could find, right? We have the great Chinese red dragons. We have, I think this is meant to be a Greek dragon, so that it has like Cerberus, the three heads, possibly. But Cerberus is a dog, so I don't know. I don't know why this one has three heads. A water dragon, as it were. And of course, they get bigger and bigger. These are, you know, these puppets, right? It's like, here, you can now make your dragon come alive and wiggle its ears, and have great sea serpents of dragons as well if you need a giant dragon. Now, you would be amazed to find, oh, and I have some more storybooks of dragons, the Custard the Dragon stories, so that we have the children's version of great bravery on the part of the little girl. This is Ogden Nash, and her cowardly custard dragon, right? Well, when I was growing up, I know it was a long time ago, these magnificent toys didn't exist, and so I was reduced at one point to sewing my own hand-stitched dragon, right? And the I was disappointed, I would say, at the sort of silliness, but this was the best I could find in the sort of toy store version of dragons. Things got a little bit better by the time I got to college, and this one I had on my bed all throughout college. But dragons, well, they've come a long way, even in my lifetime. And think what it was like for Tolkien back in the day, having to defend, sorry, you're going to see my cross throughout all of these episodes, right? Having to defend even having the dragon in the great epic of Beowulf. Now, back in, I'm playing, I hope giving you all a history of, you know, my own engagement with the stories, but also the transformation of our culture over even my own lifetime, but over, you know, Tolkien's storytelling lifetime, from a culture in which, you know, Tolkien as the scholar, the Don at Oxford, has to give this lecture defending Beowulf as a work of literature against the critics who would rather take it apart and look for pieces of Anglo-Saxon social history in it. That was his primary concern. He has a variety of criticisms in The Monster and the Critics, and gives you a number of allegories to figure out why it was such a problem. My favorite, right? He's going to present the problem allegorically first, saying that Beowulf was originally christened poetry, Poesos Anglo-Saxonicae egregium exemplum, the great example of Anglo-Saxon poetry. But the fairy godmother, later invited to superintend its fortunes, was Historia. His complaint was that over the course of previous generations, late 19th, early 20th century, scholarship had refused to read Beowulf as itself a poem, and used it instead as a kind of source book, right, for history. She brought with her Philologia, Mythologia, Archaeologia, and Leographia, excellent ladies. But where was the child's namesake? Poesis was usually forgotten, occasionally admitted by a side door, sometimes dismissed upon the doorstep. That instead of simply reading the story, scholars would hunt for, old word forms in it. Philologia do the history of language with the poem. They would hope for mythology in it, whether they could find it or not. Use it as a way of reading archaeological finds, and what does he mean by Leographia? The sort of folklore, right? I think he's fancying up the term folklore. And therefore, in Tolkien's argument, they constantly missed the point, right? His other, so one, he has the fairy godmothers christening the poem under different categories. Another of his, and then he wasn't finished, right? He's like, I'm going to give you like a gazillion allegories, says the scholar who doesn't like allegory, right? Another allegory he gives is that of the tower, right? I would express the whole industry. And yet another allegory, a man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he had actually lived, not far from the house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. So this is a metaphor for the way in which Tolkien's imagining the composition of Beowulf. But his friends coming perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building, other stories. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor, in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it, and forgot even the stones. They all said, "This tower is most interesting," but they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it's in." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did he not restore the old house? He has no sense of proportion." But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. Again and again and again, Tolkien is saying the scholars come and refuse to accept the story for what it is. They're always looking for Ingeld in it. They're looking for pieces of other stories, because if you've read Beowulf, hopefully some of you've read Beowulf, it alludes to lots of other stories. It's a great story about storytelling as well as a great story of itself. And so you have the Song of Creation that the bard sings in the mead hall. You have the references to other feuds that the characters in the story refer to, like, for example, Ingeld. You have Beowulf and his opponents, like Unferth, boasting about yet other adventures they have been in. It's this very layered exercise in reference and self-referencing. And Tolkien is saying, the scholars who've come, they found all these other stories in it, recognized them as clues to older versions of the legendarium, and pushed it all over. And okay, now this is always the metaphor that I say to ask my students, are you worried that we're doing this with Tolkien himself, right? It's like, if we're going through the different themes and the different practices and the sort of arguments that Tolkien himself has made for writing fairy stories or writing his own stories, are we not then doing the same monstrous thing that Tolkien says the critics did to Beowulf? Well, he kind of always said he didn't do allegory either. So it's a complicated problem, right? It's like, how do you get to the understanding of what a story is for? Well, he gives yet a third allegory about how Beowulf is in fact like this Babel of the Jabberwock, right? And so now we've invoked yet another monster. I actually found some Jabberwocky books on the bookshelf when I was looking. I knew I should have brought them by. Always know I should bring everything to the camera. So here we have, yet another Beowulf. Here's the Jabberwock that plays out. Beowulf is a half-baked native epic, the development of which was killed by Latin learning. It was inspired by emulation of Virgil, and is a product of the education that came in with Christianity. It is a feeble and incompetent as a narrative. The rules of narrative are cleverly observed in the manner of learned epic. It is the confused product of a committee of muddle-headed and probably beer-bemused Anglo-Saxons. This is a Gallic voice, a French critic. It is a string of pagan lays edited by monks. It is the work of a learned but inaccurate Christian antiquarian. It is a work of genius, rare and surprising in the period, though the genius seems to have been shown principally in doing something much better left undone. This is a very recent voice. It is a wild folk tale, general chorus. It is a poem of an aristocratic and courtly tradition, same voices. It is a hodgepodge. It is a sociological, anthropological, archaeological document. It is a mythical allegory, very old voices these, and generally shouted down, but not so far out as some of the newer cries. It is rude and rough. It is a masterpiece of metrical art. It has no shape at all. It is singularly weak in construction. It is a clever allegory of contemporary politics. Old John Earl, with some slight support from Mr. Girvan, only they look to different periods. Its architecture is solid. It is thin and cheap, a solemn voice. It is undeniably weighty, the same voice. It is a national epic. It is a translation of the Danish. It was imported by Frisian traders. It is a burden to English syllabuses. And final universal chorus of all voices. It's worth studying. Or is it? and you realize there he's claimed at some point, saying, I've only read a little bit in this literature, and saying this is already by 1936. There's a vast industry of commentary on Beowulf And what Tolkien says, all of these commentators had persistently left out was any concern for the monsters, right? So that's the monsters and the critics, but there's also this monstrousness of the criticism. Can we make sense of the story without taking the dragons and Grendel and Grendel's mother seriously, but the dragons in particular, right? He's just like Tolkien had been himself, as we learned last time from that excerpt I read on fairy stories about stories for children. Tolkien had always, he says, loved dragons, and so he comes to Beowulf with this great desire to have, well, more of them. So why is it that the critics had so much trouble? Well, I showed you some of my toys and everything. You're probably saying, well, dragons are silly, right? We don't want more dragons. By 1974, I was already showing you this when Ursula Le Guin was writing about the problem of fantasy writing and the problem of exactly who reads it, right? She claims that, well, Americans, 20 years after the Lord of the Rings come out, but still 1974, Americans are still afraid of dragons. And she said, what is it to be afraid of dragons? And she goes through these little scenario of saying, well, Americans are a technological people, and highly technological people are often afraid of fantasy. You could see here potentially, I suppose, a split between the sci-fi and the fantasy conversation, but it's more than that. It's like the businessman in particular, she says, tends to look on fantasy literature and say, oh, well, my wife reads that stuff, right? An old version of the women waste their time on silliness, right? My wife reads novels, I haven't got the time. Men certainly have spent the last 40 years telling lots and lots and lots of fantasy stories, making lots and lots of money off them. So the claim, back in 1974, where businessmen worried more about what she says the great fantasies of the ticker tape. She does say that, I'm pretty sure. It comes later in the essay. Now, of course, the ticker tape is all of the gaming industry, all of the movie industry is very, 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 very profitable. But have we changed our idea about the significance of fantasy? Think about the most famous dragons right now with the Game of Thrones, right? And the Martin was doing a lot of things, but one of the things he was definitely doing was writing an anti-Tolkien, in the sense that he was writing an unromance, right? The whatever sort of chivalric ideals the characters start out with in the Game of Thrones, by the end of it, they've been horribly disabused of any sense of nobility and virtue, arguably, and arguably that Martin was doing that on purpose. So the dragons, get brought into this political argument. The Dragon Riders of Pern was interesting, because McCaffrey plays off of the sense of, well, they're fantasy, but they're actually in a space novel. You learn eventually, right? So have we come any closer to appreciating dragons for what Tolkien thought they were useful for? Well, Le Guin suggests that another of the reasons that people are nervous about dragons, or Americans are afraid of dragons, is they're impractical, right? And that it's kind of a secular puritanism that refuses the place of dragons in the, well, I know it's like, if you're starting to say that the imagination has a utility, or then you falling back into that American pragmatism. But anyway, she has this wonderful passage where literature is concerned. In the old truly Puritan days, the only permitted reading was the Bible. Nowadays, with our secular Puritanism, the man who refuses to read novels because it's unmanly to do so, or because they aren't true, will most likely end up watching bloody detective thrillers on the television, or reading hack westerns or sports stories, or going in for pornography from Playboy on down. Her argument, it's his starved imagination craving nourishment that forces him to do so. But he can rationalize such entertainment by saying that it's realistic. After all, sex exists, and there are criminals, and there are baseball players, and there used to be cowboys. And also by saying that it's virile, by which he means that it doesn't interest most women. Fake realism, she says, is the escapist literature of our time. So, I don't actually know what Le Guin would think about Game of Thrones, but there is that tension between, you want to make the dragons as realistic as possible, and then give them this sort of realpolitik characteristic. Does that then give them the same role that the Beowulf dragon has, according to Tolkien? Well, utility and the play of the imagination seem to be at the heart of the question, right? Well, what did Tolkien say? Well, Tolkien himself claims, we saw him on fairy stories saying that as a child he had longed for dragons, and in fact he refers in his letter to Auden to the first story he ever tried writing. He says he was 7, but in another letter he says he was 6, so 6 or 7, and he wanted to write a story about a green great dragon. And he says the only thing he remembers about that story, or verse, as he says in the other letter, is that his mother told him, you can't say green great dragon, you have to say great green dragon. And he sort of puzzled over that philological problem of why the adjectives had to be in what she said that order ought to be, as opposed to the other. So dragons had clearly been on his mind since childhood, and yet I was sort of playing around and thinking about how to do a taxonomy of dragons for you from Tolkien's perspective, finding that although they show up in his stories constantly, he actually theorized almost nowhere about them, except in his lecture on Beowulf, right, on the monsters. So we're kind of stuck in a kind of interpretive problem, like the one that he says people were doing to the Beowulf poem. We don't have the Beowulf poet telling us what he thought those monsters were, and we don't really have Tolkien telling us what he thought his dragons were, except for indirectly by what he thought the Beowulf dragon was. So let's say the taxonomy of dragons. I want to do a full taxonomy of Tolkien's dragons. We need not only his translation of the Beowulf poem, but also a bunch of his other stories. So Farmer Giles of Ham has the dragon Chrysophylax, and this story, Chrysophylax Dives was very rich, of ancient and imperial lineage. He was cunning, inquisitive, greedy, well armored, but not over bold, and very hungry. And in Farmer Giles of Ham, a giant tells the dragons that there's good to eat and to be had nearby where Farmer Giles lives, and so Chrysophylax, hearing this story from the giant, goes and eats up a variety of animals, but Farmer Giles manages to tame the dragon. We'll talk about this story in more depth eventually. And so the joke that Tolkien makes about the story of the dragon is basically he's Farmer Giles of Tame, the tame dragon. And so in this story, the dragon is, well, clever and greedy and has a hoard and of treasure, but it mainly exists to be outwitted by Farmer Giles. Not a, it's a joke of a dragon taming rather than a dragon slaying story. There's a dragon in Roverandom that lives on the moon, the white dragon, and it's this white dragon that causes eclipses. All the white dragons originally come from the moon, as you probably know, but this one had been to the world and back, so he'd learned a thing or two. He fought the red dragon in Caerdragon in Merlin's time, as you will find in all the more up-to-date history books. after which the other dragon was very red. Later he did lots more damage in the Three Islands and went to live on the top of Snowdon for a time in Wales. People did not bother to climb up while that lasted, except for one man, and the dragon caught him drinking out of a bottle. That man finished in such a hurry they left the bottle on the top, and his example has been followed by many people. There's all these little sort of place name jokes, and the reference to the great Arthurian dragons in the Geoffrey Monmouth stories of Merlin. But it's all quite whimsical and it's the story for children. Roverandom is the little dog toy that comes to life and has various adventures on the moon and under the sea. And in the moon scene, the white dragon chases Roverandom and the moon dog around, and it's sort of nonsensical and silly. And he's writing Roverandom about the same time as he's writing The Hobbit, and if you compare the way in which Tolkien talks in Roverandom with the way he writes in The Hobbit, you see still in that child story mode, right? The kind of wink to the reader about, well, because you're a grown up boy or girl, and these are just little dogs, right? Or with the moment when Bilbo first sees Smaug, right? And it's his, the bravery that he has in carrying on so that he actually goes down the tunnel and sees Smaug for the first time. And here it is, the glow of Smaug. There he lay, a vast red golden dragon, fast asleep. A thrumming came from his jaws and nostrils and wisps of smoke, but his fires were low in slumber. Beneath him, under all his limbs and his huge coiled tail, and about him on all sides, stretching away across the unseen floors, lay countless piles of precious things, gold wrought and unwrought, gems and jewels, and silver red stained in the ruddy light. Smaug lay with wings folded like an immeasurable bat, turned partly on one side so that the hobbit could see his underparts and his long pale belly crusted with gems and fragments of gold from his long line on his costly bed. Behind him were the walls where nearest could dimly be seen coats of mail, helms and axes, swords and spears hanging, and there in rows stood great jars and vessels filled with a wealth that could not be guessed. So we have this hot dragon lying on this pile of gold, and the response that Bilbo has to seeing Smaug is this one of great wonder. So whereas in Farmer Giles there's this sort of ridiculous place name joke, and in Roverandom there's the kind of winking at the children about, when you climb up Mount Snowdon, people leave bottles up there. With Bilbo, we now have him, sort of faced with the majesty of Smaug. To say that Bilbo's breath was taken away is no description at all. There are no words left to express his staggerment, since men changed the language that they learned of elves in the days when all the world was wonderful. Bilbo had heard tell and sing of dragon hoards before, but the splendor, the lust, the glory of such treasure had never yet come home to him. His heart was filled and pierced with enchantment and with the desire of dwarves, and he gazed motionless, almost forgetting the frightful guardian, at the gold beyond price and count. And then, of course, he goes back and has the famous conversation with Smaug, where, if you've seen the Hobbit movies, right, this is the best scene, this best Benedict Cumberbatch doing the wily, clever, ruthless dragon. Well, thief, I smell you and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along. Help yourself again. There's plenty and to spare. Oh, Bilbo has, of course, stolen a cup, and that famously is the scene that ties Smaug to Beowulf Dragon, because that's how the Beowulf Dragon wakes up. We'll get to that in a second. But we're getting to the point where it's like Bilbo is, child size as a hobbit, and encountering the dragon. He's very brave to encounter the dragon, and Smaug is going to have this sort of clever riddling conversation with him. But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smaug hoped to get him to come nearer so easily, he was disappointed. "No, thank you, O Smaug the Tremendous," he replied. "I did not come for presents. I only wished to have a look at you and see if you were truly as great as tales say. I did not believe them." "Do you now?" said the dragon, somewhat flattered. though he did not believe a word of it. Truly songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities, replied Bilbo. You have nice manners for a thief and a liar, said the dragon. You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you, and where do you come from, may I ask? You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hill, and under the hills, and over the hills my paths led. And through the air I am he that walks unseen. So I can well believe, said Smaug, but that is hardly your usual name. I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number. Lovely titles, sneered the dragon, but lucky numbers don't always come off. I am he that buries his friends alive, and drowns them, and draws them alive from the water. I came from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me. Those don't sound so credible, scoffed Smaug. I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am the ring winner and the luck wearer. I am barrel rider, went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling. That's better, said Smaug, but don't let your imagination run away with you. This, of course, is the way to talk to dragons, if you don't want to reveal your proper name, which is wise, and don't want to infuriate them by a flat refusal, which is also very wise. No dragon can resist the fascination of riddling talk and wasting time trying to understand it. There was a lot here which Smaug did not understand at all, though I expect you do, since you know all about Bilbo's adventures to which he was referring, but he thought he understood enough, and he chuckled in his wicked inside. And so forth. So you have these sort of childlike stories of dragons by a man who at the same time, excuse me, digging up all this dragon lore brought up all the dust in my apartment. A man at the same time who is, I mean, literally the same time, right? He's writing Roverandom and The Hobbit pretty much the exact same time he's writing Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, the lecture. He actually gave the lecture in November, 25th November 1936. It was the Sir Israel Golanc's memorial lecture to the British Academy. And so he's got dragons on his mind throughout the 30s. And in Beowulf, he's insisting that they're the most serious part of the poem that the critics have been ignoring, and yet in his own writing, he's still creating these sort of whimsical little interactions with the dragon. And dragons are creatures that you play riddle games with, and children should be clever enough to figure out how to talk to them, and little dogs on the moon couldn't run away from them. Right? What is going on, right? So we had Tolkien from his childhood wanting dragons, writing stories for his children about dragons, but here in his meditation on the point of having a poem whose climax is a battle with a dragon, Beowulf, saying this is the most serious thing that we can be talking about. Well, one of the it's like, and you might think based on all of this dragons, right? It's like the number, I've lost my books, the number of dragons that we can now pretend to know about, all the different varieties of dragons that it's like this book seems to have. This one's the red wyvern, right? So if you're gonna do dragon taxonomy, you're going to know all of the subcategories of dragons and so forth. You would think that they're everywhere in medieval literature, and that would be why Tolkien is saying that they matter, right? It's like Chambers was saying, oh well, the true heroic poets wouldn't have traded they wouldn't have traded the story of Engeld for a whole wilderness of dragons. Well, here's the catch. As for the poem, one dragon, however hot, does not make a summer or a host. A man might well exchange for one good dragon what he will not sell for wilderness. And dragons, real dragons, essential both to the machinery and the ideas of a poem or tale, are actually rare. In northern literature, there are only two that are significant. Right? It's like you might get the idea One from Tolkien's, sort of constant repetition of dragons in his own stories, and from this impression that he gives you in The Hobbit that, well, you know how to talk to dragons, and that, riddling with dragons is very common, and you would know how to it's like, oh, well, there must be loads and loads and loads and loads of stories from medieval literature about dragons, right? Actually, no. In Northern literature, by which he means sort of Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Norse, nexus, right? Northern being all of the non-Mediterranean stories. There's only two. They're both mentioned in Beowulf, and that they are both referenced in Tolkien's own storytelling. But there's this Tolkien, by the success of The Hobbit, and then the subsequent success of Tolkien stories, and the subsequent success of the whole Dungeons and Dragons sort of culture that we now live in, give you this impression that there's great wilderness of dragons out there in medieval literature, and there are really only two in the northern story world. If we omit from consideration the vast and vague encircler of the world, Midgardsormr, so just the dragon that surrounds Middle Earth, the doom of the great gods, and no matter for heroes, we have but the dragon of the Volsungs, Fafnir, and Beowulf's bane. And Beowulf's dragon has no name, right? So there's Fafnir, whom Sigurd slays, and that story is at the center of, among other things, Wagner, right? And Beowulf's dragon, and that's it. It is true that both of these are in Beowulf, one in the main story and the other spoken of by a minstrel praising Beowulf himself, right? To say that Beowulf as a poem has these layers of other stories and references and so forth. And so both Sigurd's dragon, Fafnir, and Beowulf's dragon are in Beowulf. But this is not a wilderness of dragons. Indeed, the allusion to the more renowned worm killed by the Velsing is sufficient indication that the poet selected a dragon of well-founded purpose, or saw its significance in the plot as it had reached him, even as he was careful to compare his hero, Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, to the prince of the heroes of the north, the dragon-slaying Wælsing. He esteemed dragons as rare as they are dire, as some do still. He liked them as a poet, not as a sober zoologist, and he had good reason. So this is Tolkien's argument, for all of his great lifelong desire for dragons, he could, in the literature that he loved, in fact find only two. And he, of course, spent his life teaching the description of Beowulf's bane. And so when he went to write his own dragon, to write Smaug, and the setup for how Bilbo comes to take the proof that he's actually made it into the lair, Tolkien uses the setup in Beowulf to tell that story. But that's it, right? These are the dragons you have. And indeed, the Beowulf dragon is all of the things that Smaug is. He's fire-breathing and has a great hoard. Here's the setup for the theft of the goblet, right? So Beowulf has been king of his own people for 50 years. He ruled it for 50 winters. Now was he a king of many years, aged guardian of his rightful land, until a certain one in the dark nights began to hold sway, a dragon, even he who on the high heath watched his hoard, his steep stone barrow. Below lay a path little known to men. Therein went some nameless man, creeping in nigh to the pagan treasure. His hand seized a goblet, deep, bright with gems. This the dragon did not after in silence bear, albeit he had been cheated in his sleep by thief's cunning. This the people learned, men of the neighboring folk, that he was wroth indeed. By no means of intent had that man broken the dragon's hoard of his own will, he who thus wronged him grievously, but in dire need, being the thrall of some one among the sons of mighty men, he had fled from the lashes of wrath, and having no house he crept therein, a man burdened with guilt. Soon did the dragon bestir himself, ... that swiftly upon the trespasser dire terror fell, yet none the less ill-fated one, ... when the sudden danger came on him, he saw a treasure chest. Okay, so there's some passages missing in in the poem, and Tolkien's not filling them in his translation. So the thief comes in, he's steals something to take back to his master, and having stolen it, wakes up the dragon, and the dragon's now angry, and the serpent wakes up and realizes that the cup is gone. New strife. Then the serpent woke. New strife arose. He smelt not now along the rock, and grim-hearted he perceived the footprint of his foe, who in his stealth had stepped right nigh, yea, close to the dragon's head. Thus may indeed one whose fate is not to die with ease escape woe and evil lot, if he have the favor of the Lord. The guardian of the hoard searched eagerly about the ground, desiring to discover the man who had thus wrought him injury as he lay in sleep. Burning, woeful at heart, oft-times he compassed all the circuit of the mound, but no man was there in the waste. None the less he thought with joy of battle, of making war. Ever and anon he turned him back into the barrow, seeking the jeweled vessel. So there's no conversation in Beowulf between the thrall who takes the cup and the dragon. The dragon sniffs him out, and that sniffing we saw is used in The Hobbit. The dragon wakes up and can smell Bilbo, even though he's invisible. But there's no conversation. Tolkien invents that completely. Quickly he had discovered this, that some one among men had explored the gold and mighty treasure, and torment the guardian of the hoard abode till evening came. Then was the keeper of the barrow, swollen with wrath, purposing, fell beast, with fire to avenge his precious drinking vessel. Now was the day fated to the serpent's joy. No longer would he tarry on the mountainside, but went blazing forth, sped with fire. Terrible for the people in that land was the beginning of that war, even as swift and bitter came its end upon their lord and patron. Now the invader did begin to spew forth glowing fires, and set ablaze the shining halls. The light of the burning leapt forth to the woe of men. No creature there did that fell winger of the air purpose to leave alive. Wide might it be seen how the serpent wit to war, the malice of that fell oppressor. From near and far be seen how that destroyer in battle pursued and humbled the people of the Geats. Back to his hoard he sped to his dark hall ere the time of day. He had wrapped the dwellers in the land of flame and fire and burning. He trusted in his barrow and its wall, and his own warlike might, and his trust cheated him. Now, so in Beowulf as king recognizes that he needs to defend his people, and so he takes a band of retainers to go fight the dragon. All of the retainers run away except for Wiglaf. Beowulf goes to fight the dragon on his own. He manages to kill the dragon, but the dragon wounds him so badly that he dies, and in his last moments he begs Wiglaf to go get him something from the hoard and show it to him so that he knows what he's died for, in effect. And in the poem, in Beowulf, when Beowulf dies, on the one hand, it was right for him to go to the defense of his people. You can think about the way Tolkien plays off in the Battle of the Five Armies and so forth. It's not exactly the same structure, right, with Thorin deciding that he's going to defend his own hoard, right? That's not what Beowulf does. Beowulf fights the dragon to kill it so that it will stop hurting his own people. But with Beowulf dead, and this is the end of the story, the end of Beowulf itself is that his own people are now going to be overrun by invaders because he's no longer there to defend them, and they mourn him. And it's unclear in the way the poem ends whether or not Beowulf has actually had a good there's ambiguity, right? Then about the tomb rode warriors valiant, sons of princes, 12 men in all, who with their woe bewail, their king lament, a dirge upraising, that man praising, honoring his prowess and his mighty deeds, his worth esteeming, even as is meet that a man should his lord beloved in words extol and heart cherish, when forth he must from the raiment of flesh be taken far away. Thus bemoaned the Geatish folk their master's fall, comrades of his hearth, crying that he was ever of the kings of earth of men most generous, and to men most gracious, to his people most tender, and for praise most eager. That and this is when Tolkien is talking about the Jabberwock of voices saying it's a Christian story, it's a pagan story, it's a Christian story, it's a pagan story. This is the tension in Beowulf the poem. Is in fact Beowulf, what kind of hero is he, right? And you'll have noticed in that moment when I was reading about the dragon waking up, that the thus may indeed one whose fate is not to escape with ease, escape woe and evil lot, if he have the favor of the Lord. The Beowulf poet seems to regularly be referring to God, as in God as Christians understand God, but Beowulf himself as the king who's responsible for caring for his people and slayer of monsters, and the dragon's the dragon's enemy, doesn't know God in Christian terms, right? He fights for his fame. He spends his life boasting about the great number of monsters that he's killed, and this for Tolkien was the great mystery of what the monsters meant. And in that sense, he thought, okay, so we have these the two dragons in Northern literature, Fafnir and Beowulf's Bane, and they seem, and here Tolkien's playing that kind of game of looking for resonances, right? They seem to have this air of something other than simply being, well, what? And it's very interesting in The Monsters and the Critics, the way in which Tolkien sort of dances around the problem of exactly what do these monsters mean, and I think also dancing around the problem of what he wants them to mean. Right? We saw Le Guin wanting the monsters to be the thing that tests you and your willingness to, have imagination, right? Adventures, pleasure, and delight, she says. But Tolkien doesn't seem to want the monsters to be delightful and pleasurable, even though in his own stories he has, at least in his children's stories, he has this sense that monsters, are good at riddles and clever and, something that little dogs can run away from. There's a lot of puzzling out of what the monsters are, and he says, in defense of the dragons, for example, this is really important, right? That the prince of the heroes of the North, supremely memorable, was a dragon slayer. We only have two of them, but the great heroes of Northern literature were these two dragon slayers, Sigurd and Beowulf. Although there is plainly considerable difference between the later Norse and the ancient English form of the story alluded to in Beowulf, already there it had these two primary features: the dragon and the slaying of him as the chief deed of the greatest of heroes. A dragon is no idle fancy. Whatever may be his origins in fact or invention, the dragon in legend is a potent creation of men's imagination, richer in significance than his barrow is in gold. And then he goes on to talk about people still being inspired by this imagery, but this a dragon is no idle fancy, right? So again, he's struggling with himself, because he had these dragons in his children's stories and saying, oh, they're just for children, they're sort of whimsical. And it's like at the very same time he's saying, no, the dragon slayer is the great hero. He's the most important figure in this heroic literature, and he needs a dragon. He needs a dragon to slay. Why? What is a dragon to the Beowulf poet? Well, to Beowulf, and this is where he's like, wow, this is great. Tolkien uses the Beowulf dragon as his model for Smaug, and we know Smaug is this great dragon, except he does riddles with Bill. Okay, well, never mind. We know that the Beowulf dragon is his model and his great dragon. Well, but actually he's not. Right? This is a sort of, I get that reading Tolkien with you is starting to feel fairly frustrating. It must be from your perspective too, right? It's like me, I'm saying that it's Christian, it's pagan, it's Christian, it's pagan. I was looking out into the social media world today to find some more Tolkien groups to say hi to, and there's a as with Tolkien's, the critics reading of Beowulf, there's this great split. Well, it's really a Christian poem told the monsters have Christian morals and Christian significance. No, it's a pagan story that we're tapping into the great oral tradition that it was lost, and those monks they and then you have to do lots of sort of flip-flops to say, well, the monks, because it is a monastic text, because all texts in Anglo-Saxon England were written by Christians, right? That the Christians bring writing, and they bring writing all these stories down. So if we have any of the stories that we do, they're written by Christians. So Christian writing down a poem about a dragon slayer, but he must have really loved the ancient pagan stories, and so it's actually really a pagan story. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The conversation on this has been going on for 100, 200 years. And Tolkien's right there in the middle of it, trying to figure out, I think, why he loves dragons so much. Like, why are they such a potent character in all of these stories, without taking away their fascination and their magic. And yet every time you try to say what a dragon is, it divests it of some of its magic. And Tolkien he's really worried about doing that, and yet he does it himself to Beowulf's dragon, right? He says here, Beowulf's dragon, if one wishes really to criticize, is not to be blamed for being a dragon, but rather for not being dragon enough. Plain, pure fairy story dragon. Okay, so now there's no wilderness of dragons, there's just two, and one of them isn't really very good. There are in the poem some vivid touches of the right kind, in which this dragon is real worm, with a bestial life and thought of his own. I mean, I just read the passage where he wakes up sniffing around his cave looking for the cup that the thrall has stolen. That sounds fairly bestial, right? It is interesting, just like what beast are dragons modeled off of? Are they dogs? In Farmer Giles of Ham, the dragon is really a giant dog, because he gets tamed and disciplined and goes back off to his cave and sulks. Are they? And Roverandom is also obviously a giant dog. Smaug is sort of dog-like, right? He's giant, but he's tameable, and you can talk to him. So bestial life and thought of his own, but Tolkien clearly wants him to be something other than just the kinds of animals we already know. But the conception nonetheless approaches Draconitas rather than Draco, a personification of malice, greed, destruction, the evil side of heroic life, and of the undiscriminating cruelty of fortune that distinguishes not good or bad, the evil aspect of all life. So Tolkien is saying that on the one hand, the Beowulf dragon seems to be a real animal. He wants him to be bestial. So it's like a plain pure fairy story dragon would be the most realistic dragon, right? The fairy story, the fantastic version of the dragon would be the most real. But Tolkien worries that even in the Beowulf poem, and I'll say it again a zillion times again, which is our only real big fully described dragon in Northern literature, it's not really a dragon. It's a concept, right? Malice, greed, destruction. So it's the evil sin, right? It's an image of the failure of human beings projected into this allegorical figure, this personification, or it's a sort of natural force, right? Actually not natural force, because that would make it like thunder and lightning, right? Fortune, which has another valence, which is it's not good or bad, just it happens, right? Which is the evil aspect of all life, which is that there's no reason to anything, right? It's just accident. So the Beowulf dragon, Tolkien is saying, is either partly beast, partly sin, the image of sin, personification of sin, partly the agent of fate. Which is okay, he argues, for the poem. But for Beowulf, the poem, that is as it should be. In this poem, the balance is nice, but it's preserved. Nice means it's right there on the knife edge, right? You're not entirely sure whether this Christian poet telling you this ancient ancestral, let's say ancestral rather than pagan, right? This ancestral story, we're not even sure which ancestors it is because it's written in Old English. It's about Danes and Geats. Thus the argument that it's potentially translated from Danish. Fine. But that's fine, Tolkien says. The large symbolism is near the surface, but it does not break through nor become allegory. Something more significant than a standard hero, a man faced with a foe more evil than any human enemy of house or realm, is before us, yet incarnate in time, walking in heroic history, and treading the named lands of the north. And this, we are told, is the radical defect of Beowulf, that its author, coming in a time rich in the legends of heroic men, has used them afresh in an original fashion, giving us not just one more, but something akin yet different, a measure and interpretation of them all. Now, he's arguing with the critics and trying to make it so that you're saying, yes, this poet has taken this figure from old legend, transformed it, made it complicated, done something more marvelous with it than simply allegorized the dragon, and kept it right there, sort of in tension between allegory and true beast. And Tolkien's saying, and this is why we should really appreciate the poem. And then he tries a little bit further. But on the other hand, and this is where I think he's trying really, really hard to find the truth of the dragon and saying it's really heroic, right? It's not quite Christian. It's not quite there. And that we have some sense of what the dragons were before they became Christian. And then you see what he's actually, what Tolkien is always longing for. Of English pre-Christian mythology, we know practically nothing. Here again, these dragons, they're like rocks peeking out from under the soil, and maybe there really were dragon bones there in the rocks previously, and we can barely glimpse them. We can just kind of see them. And thank goodness that this dragon hasn't become a fully Christian dragon, because perhaps in that we can still see what it is that the pre-Christian imagination made of reality, of the world. But then you're back to the problem that the Beowulf poem is itself written by a Christian, and Tolkien says, but in England this imagination, this northern imagination, was brought into touch with Christendom and with scripture, and suddenly we don't know what to do with the monsters. We don't know how to understand the monsters. The monsters, he argues, in this pre-Christian mythology that he wishes we still had, but somehow don't, but that the dragons seem to be intimations of, are the stories in which the monsters had been foes of the gods, the captains of men, and within time the monsters would win. In a Christian story, there's hope for salvation, for resurrection, for heaven. But in the old pagan stories, the pre-Christian stories, the northern stories, it was all about the long defeat, right? Almost, we might say, that this poem was, in one direction, inspired by the debate that had long been held and continued after, and it was one of the chief contributions to the controversy. Shall we, or shall we not, consign the heathen ancestors to perdition? What good will it do posterity to read the battles of Hector in the Greek mythology, right? Quid hinieldis cum Christo? Great question that Alcuin had asked in the Carolingian court. What does Ingeld have to do with Christ? The author of Beowulf showed forth the permanent value of that pietas which treasures the memory of man's struggles in the dark past, man fallen and not yet saved, disgraced but not dethroned. Okay, now here's yet again one of those little clues and hints that Tolkien gives. Remember when in Mythopoeia where he talks about disgraced but still make within the law in which we're made? Tolkien is constantly trying to have his cake and eat it too, I suppose. His dragons and his Christianity. His Christian poet telling the story of Beowulf's battle with the dragon and alluding to Ingeld among other things. So these great stories of the past which treasures the memory of man's struggles in the dark past, man fallen and not yet saved, disgraced but not dethroned. And again, over and over and over again, regretting and wishing that we had more of this mythological imagination that put, as he says, the monsters in the center, gave them victory but no honor, and found a potent but terrible solution in naked will and courage. What is it that Tolkien is longing for here? What kind of story is he wishing that we had more of? Now he casts it, and this I think is important and significant in the way in which we think about Christianity, as if Christianity is always fundamentally at odds with these old mythologies, because the old mythologies have stories of the heroes fighting the monsters, and the old mythologies give those struggles without hope a kind of dignity. So this I think is what draws people to Tolkien's fantasy, and always to his insistence that he's not trying to write allegory, and therefore this isn't Narnia, and therefore you're not going to find, Christ images in the characters, or even in the relationships between the characters, but that you're longing for this atmosphere of not really fatalism, resignation. I mean, he says pietas, for the recognition of what the heroes wrought before they were brought into the light of the gospel, which then will, constantly, as always, make you think, oh, well, Christianity has no mythology. Well, just as there are only two great dragons in northern literature, you say only, or there are two great dragons in northern literature, there's some beasts in the Bible. Let's see if you recognize this one. There's the double chapter, right? And the speaker is saying, do you know this monster? Who can discover the face of his garment, or who can go into the midst of his mouth? Who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His body is like molten shields, shut close up with scales pressing upon one another. One is joined to another, and not so much as any air can come between them. They stick to one another, and they hold fast one another fast, and shall not be separated. His sneezing is like the shining of fire, and his eyes like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go forth lamps, like torches of lighted fire. Out of his nostrils goes smoke, like that of a pot heated and boiling. His breath kindled coals, and a flame cometh forth out of his mouth. In his neck strength shall dwell, and want goeth before his face. The members of his flesh cleave to one another. He shall send lightnings against him, and they shall not be carried to another place. His heart shall be as hard as a stone, and as firm as a smith's anvil. When he shall raise him up, the angels shall fear, being affrighted, shall purify themselves. When a sword shall lay at him, it shall not be able to hold, nor a spear, nor a breastplate. for he shall esteem iron as straw and brass as rotten wood. The archer shall not put him to flight. The stones of the sling are to him like stubble. As stubble will he esteem the hammer, and he will laugh him to scorn who shaketh the spear. The beams of the sun shall be under him, and he shall strew gold under him like mire. He shall make the sea, deep sea to boil like a pot, and shall make it as when ointments boil. A path shall shine after him. He shall esteem the deep as growing old. There is no power upon earth that can be compared with him who is made to fear no one. He beholdeth every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. Well, that rather sounds like a fire-breathing dragon. And it's, of course, God's description of the Leviathan in Job, and God is boasting to Job that he fought this monster, right? So, one, the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the Old Testament, the Lord of the angels, comes forth mighty in battle, and fights the dragon, right? So there's one dragon, which the Beowulf poet would have known very, very well, because one of the great Christian meditations on this dragon is the Moralian Job of Gregory the Great. And Gregory the Great was the pope who sent the missionaries to England, and therefore was very, very deeply revered in Anglo-Saxon England for his learning. And the Moralia in Job, this is volume 3 of 3, but they're all like this, right, is this massive meditation, including, for example, this reading of the Leviathan. So, the Lord therefore bores through the jaw of this Leviathan with a bracelet, because by the ineffable power of his mercy he so thwarts the malice of the ancient enemy that he sometimes loses even those whom he has seized, and they as it were fall from his mouth, who after the commission of sin return to innocence. For who that had once been seized by his mouth would escape his jaw if it were not bored through? Had he not seized Peter in his mouth when he denied? Had he not seized David in his mouth when he plunged himself into such a gulf of lust? But when they returned each of them through penitence to life, this Leviathan let them escape, as it were, through the holes of his jaws. Those therefore are withdrawn from his mouth through the hole of his jaw, who after the perpetration of such great wickedness have come back with penitence. But what man can escape the mouth of this Leviathan so as not to commit anything unlawful? Again, I could obviously go on and on and on. This when Tolkien is talking about the way the dragon becomes an image of sin, it's going to be through Gregory the Great's allegorizing of the dragon that Yahweh, the Lord, has meant to fight. But of course, there's other great dragon fighters in the scriptures. Here's another one. And I realize I have my lady here, and I can threaten her with this dragon, right? And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his testament was seen in his temple. And there were lightnings and voices, and earthquake and great hail. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And being with child, she cried, travailing in birth, and was in pain to be delivered. And there was seen another sign in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon. I guess I should be using this one, the red one. Having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to be delivered, that when she should be delivered, he might devour her son. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all the nations with an iron rod, and her son was taken up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, that they should feed her 1,260 days. And there was a great battle in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. And they prevailed not, neither was their place any more in heaven. And that great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, who seduceth the whole world, and he was cast unto the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now is come salvation, and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ, because the accuser of our brethren is cast forth, who accused them before our God day and night. There's more of the dragon battle, but to realize that although we think about great dragon battles as being, Wagner and Wagnerian or pagan. They're great they're great dragon battles in both the Old Testament, in the book of Job, and in the New Testament, in Revelation. And Michael as dragon slayer or Yahweh as dragon slayer are both the great angels who fight the dragons. So why do we consider dragon battles something that only pagan stories contain? They don't. And then when you end up thinking, sort of wrestling with Tolkien's trying to understand, is the Beowulf dragon really a pagan dragon, or is it a Christianized remembrance of a previous story? Perhaps these questions are so hard to answer because we are so unaccustomed to recognizing the story world of Christianity as well, and that the difference may not be, well, it's like, and I'm not doing a perennialism argument here because I don't think that's what's happening. I think we're somehow going to have to keep wrestling with this tension between the theological and the fantastic, right? Is fairy an image of heaven? Is heaven a category of fairy? Is the imagination, and remember Tolkien said on fairy stories that the dragon is no idle fancy, whatever may be his origins, in fact or invention. The dragon in legend is a potent creation of men's imagination, richer in significance than his barrow is in gold. Is the Beowulf dragon the same kind of creature as the Leviathan? Is Fafnir the same kind of creation as the dragon that St. Michael fights? Why do we put them in different categories of either literature or of tradition? And what does the tension between those categories tell us about our own perceptions of storytelling, imagination, truth, and so forth? Well, I'm not going to be able to answer that today. I wanted to put it to you. It's like setting up all of these sort of frameworks that we've been working through between Tolkien's desire to write a body of connected legend, between his arguments with Lewis about the purposes of mythology, between his need for a storyteller in Tom Bombadil, to the audience that he's thinking of, and now realize that even the elements that he's putting in that might seem to define what he's doing as primarily fantasy dragons have raised category issues for us of literature as well as of interpretation of what it is that these creatures actually mean. The dragons play another kind of role in the scriptures, not just in terms of battling, right, but also singing praises. And this is, now I can't remember whether I read you this song before. I think I've been doing too many videos. But this song is also part of dragon lore. Praise ye the Lord from the heavens, praise ye in the high places, praise ye him all his angels, praise him all his host. Praise ye him, O sun and moon, praise him all ye stars and light. Praise him, ye heaven and heavens, and let all the waters that are above the heavens praise the name of the Lord. For he spoke, and they were made, he commanded, and they were created. He hath established them forever and for ages of ages. He hath made a decree, and it shall not pass away. Praise the Lord from the earth, ye dragons, and all ye deeps. Fire, hail, snow, ice, stormy winds, which fulfill his word. Mountains and all hills, fruitful trees and all cedars, beasts and all cattle, serpents and feathered fowls, kings of the earth and all people, princes and all judges of the earth, young men and maidens, let the old with the younger praise the name of the Lord, for his name alone is exalted. The praise of him is above heaven and earth, and he hath exalted the horn of his people, a hymn to all his saints, to the children of Israel, a people approaching to him. Alleluia. If dragons are included in the list of creatures, beasts and all cattle, serpents and feather fowls, of people, of natural phenomenon, fire, hail, snow, ice, stormy winds, the heavens and the heavens of heavens and the waters above the heavens and the angels, then to call dragons creatures of the imagination is as problematic as calling both beasts and angels as creatures of the imagination, because for the medieval Christians, like the Beowulf poet, dragons were really real. Now, what do we make of that? To be continued. Thanks for joining me. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. Thank you.